Perfect. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Herbert, and I am going to be your host today for our seminar series. Just have to forgive me, I'm having a computer issue. So today, welcome to the Last Drop Water Researcher Speaker Series. This series is brought to you by the University of Manitoba's Sustainable Development Goal 6 Working Group, which in 2018, the University of Manitoba was named the United Nations Academic Impact Hub for Sustainable Development Goal 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, for those of you that didn't know the background of this seminar series. So we at the U of M are the only academic institution who holds that UNAI designation in North America. And for those who don't know anything about our group, the Sustainable Development Working Group is it brings together established and emerging leaders who have a shared interest in freshwater sustainability, and we work collaboratively with national and global partners to address issues related to climate change impacts on freshwater systems at local, regional, and national scales. I believe Pauline has just put a link to our homepage in the chat. Members of the group currently include researchers from the Clayton H. Riddle Faculty of Environment, Earth and Resources. We have a new member from the Faculty of Architecture, the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences, the Faculty of Arts, and the Faculty of Science. And we have collaborators at the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning and the Office of Sustainability. So the group's expertise spans multiple disciplines, including leading researchers from across the humanities, social sciences, and STEM fields. So my name is Claire Herbert, as I mentioned earlier. I work within the Center for Earth Observation Science, which is a center within the Clayton H. Riddle Faculty of Environment, Earth and Resources. I'm a data manager for our data portal, and I'm a program manager and researcher within the Manitoba Great Lakes program. And I co-chair this group, the SDG group, with Nicole Wilson. So in this virtual format, we are all coming from different locations. And I want to acknowledge that myself, I am in Winnipeg and I work at the University of Manitoba. And so we are on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And in the theme of our water series, I also want to acknowledge that my drinking water comes from Shoal Lake through the Winnipeg Aqueduct, which was constructed in 1919 at the expense of Shoal Lake 40 First Nations water security. And so I invite all of you listening today to put what territory you are coming from. So today we have our first talk, or no, sorry, not our first talk. Today we have our next talk in our series, and it is by Dr. Deborah McGregor, who is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at Osgoode Hall Law School and Faculty of Environment Studies and Urban Change at York University, but I believe that is changing, which I will get to. And her talk today is on the ontology of water. But before we begin, I'll just go through some logistics with the group. We have enabled closed captioning, so feel free to turn that on if you need it. We will be recording this event and it will be hosted on our YouTube channel, which Pauline will also put in the chat, and you can view previous speakers also by linking either from the YouTube page or from our homepage directly. The presentation will be about 30 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A period at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box that is on your Zoom screen. And I believe we are already recording. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deborah McGregor. So, Deborah McGregor is Anishinaabe, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair, Indigenous Environmental Justice, Osgoode Hall Law School, and Faculty of Environment and Urban Change, York University, as I mentioned. Professor McGregor's research has focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including environmental and water governance, environmental justice, health and environment, climate change, and Indigenous legal traditions. Professor McGregor remains actively involved in a variety of Indigenous communities, serving as an advisor and continuing to engage in community-based research and initiatives. Professor McGregor has been at the forefront of Indigenous environmental justice and Indigenous research theory and practice. And Professor McGregor was also recently awarded a Canada Excellence Research Chair on Indigenous Ways of Knowing for Climate and Water Sustainability for Planetary Health and Well-Being, which she will take up at the University of Calgary in July 2024. So congratulations, that's great. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Professor McGregor.
Yes. Good. Can you hear me? Let's make
Yes.
sure of that. Okay, good. I see a little hand going up the screen, so I guess that's a good thing. Yeah, so thank you for having me. So I'm Anishinaabe, originally from, well, I still am from Whitefish River First Nation, and if I wasn't in Toronto, that's where I would be. But I teach Tuesday mornings, so I sort of have to be back in the city. So right now I'm in Toronto. I get to live and work in my own territory, so it's going to be quite interesting to all of a sudden be in somebody else's in the next few months. So I'll have to figure out how to navigate what that means. So I like to talk about water, or I guess talk in relation to water. So I do have a PowerPoint because that just it sort of manages me. But I did want to talk a little bit about sort of how I started to think about water differently, and when I started to realize it was important to be explicit about a different, I shouldn't say a different ontology, but probably the ontology that most humans had in relation to water for most of human existence, but then how that's changed over time and how I see it has huge implications in terms of policy development, or even something new like the Canadian Water Agency, where water has a very limited, there's a very limited conception of water that folks in power work with. So, and there's different initiatives that people have to try to expand those kind of notions. And I think that the speaker before me was Professor May Craft. She would have talked a little bit about that as part of her work, and the Decolonizing Water Project as well, which I touch on a little bit in this talk. So the way I grew up was we lived right by the water, and in the First Nation community I grew up in, we didn't have, I'll just say, running water. We didn't have plumbing, so everything, anytime we needed water, we would go to the lake and we would get water for everything that you need in order to live as a family and household. And so that in itself builds in particular kinds of practices, which people would call now sustainable use, conservation. You didn't waste water when you had to go down to the lake when it was minus 35 and, get an ice pick and make a hole in the ice and go get water, and then to heat it up in order on a wood stove in order to be able to use it for household purposes. So water was always a big part of my life. Literally, I grew up, I don't even know how many meters, probably would take me probably less than a minute to get to the shore of the water. Even if I were in my community, I'd be looking out at McGregor Bay and it would literally be 15 seconds to get to the water. So I've always lived near water. Can't see it in Toronto. Buildings are in the way, but I guess I'm near the water. So, but I guess, took it for granted until I was asked in 2000, after the Walkerton tragedy, to contribute to the Chiefs of Ontario, which is the organizing coordinating body for the 133 First Nations in Ontario, and the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation, which serves communities in terms of technology and science services, to contribute the traditional knowledge perspective on water as part of their submission to the Walkerton inquiry. And then I started to think about it differently, and learned about it in very different. My PhD was in forestry, so I was doing a lot of land-based stuff. and I just finished it literally months before I started to do what I call the water work. And since then, I've done a lot of water policy work with Chiefs of Ontario in different First Nation communities. In fact, I just got back late Friday night from a community in Northwestern Ontario dealing with water issues. So it's become part of how I think. But over time, I kind of realized, even though we'd be in these meetings, well, even before I started to work on like the Walkerton, like that kind of water, the how water is thought about there, I was working on Great Lakes issues since the 1990s, in sort of a different way of conceptualizing water, water in that sense. And over time, I realized, even though we'd be sitting in a room with different people, whoever they were, ENGOs, different levels of government, and they change, over time, over this 30-year career looking at this topic. And even with First Nations, we'd be saying water in different communities, and nations have their own words for water. In Anishinaabe, it's Nebe. But we didn't mean the same thing. Sometimes we did, but a lot of the times we didn't. Indigenous peoples have to take up, talking about water in particular ways in a lot of these discussions, even though that may not necessarily be the meaning or the ontology of how they think about water. So I thought I have to kind of make it explicit. We actually have a different ontology of water. And it doesn't mean like the water, how resource managers or water policy folks might think about it. The view of water is just very limited. And it doesn't address how, and I'll primarily speak from an Anishinaabe perspective. I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people or even First Nations across the country, in terms of what I've been taught in terms of what those water relationships look like. So I just wanted to kind of give a bit of that background, that my thinking around this has evolved. And then I go through different periods in my career, and whatever kind of water circles I happen to find myself in, a lot of that's very climate change oriented right now and biodiversity oriented, because of just the nature of the planetary health crisis at the moment. And so my orientation sort of changes, but the foundation of Indigenous thinking or First Nation thinking or Anishinaabe thinking always remains, and always trying to advocate for that perspective in these various, I'll just call them circles. So with that, I will share screen, and this is my self-management tool, is to hopefully you can see that. It's my screen says stop share, so it must mean at some point you can see it somewhere. So ontology of water. So people will always talk about First Nations worldview. That's kind of a too big of a concept, but to me, ontology, the way that I understand it and the way that I use it in the work that I do, is this: what we consider to be real. What is it that we consider to be real in our relationship to water? Epistemology would be, how do we know these things about water? That's not what I'm going to talk about here per se, because that's a whole other process. Like, how do you generate knowledge about water? But it's more like, what do we mean if we're sitting in these circles that we find ourselves in or teaching, and how do we think about, and how are we teaching about, and how we're relating to water? And this also has a lot to do with our own ontology, what we consider to be real and not real. And of course, that's going to differ across different peoples, and often our own training. Okay, so I always feel I need to start off with this. I've just been in like so many, I just call them circles, where it's just not understood that Indigenous peoples were societies, and every society has their own way of being in the world and being a society, complete society, including what our own laws and governance was in relation to what we needed in order to be able to sustain ourselves, not just survive, but to flourish and sustain ourselves in relation to what I just say, all of creation. And because it goes beyond just what people typically think of nature and environment, and how we had our own knowledge systems as part of that. So to me, it's really important to say we are actually complete societies, and we still exist. And therefore, wherever anybody is living in Canada, Indigenous peoples were there and they had knowledge that's thousands of years old. Anything later than that is kind of superimposed on top of that, sometimes displacing it, sometimes ignoring it, even though it still exists, but it was there. Actually, this is just a picture my sister sent me of the full moon. And I'll talk about how is the moon related to water. I see that relationship very clearly, but again, it's part of this ontology that I've come to learn about. But number one, Indigenous peoples, self-determining, autonomous societies, and had everything any society would have needed in order to flourish. Again, as we had our own governance systems, and we had our relationships. So sometimes I always have to correct my language when I say, well, we actually speak about our relationships or in relation to water. I find when I'm doing some of the work I'm doing, like right now, we're developing or have developed a First Nation led community source water protection plan and just develop the traditional knowledge aspect of that. And it's tricky to kind of ask these questions because when you're doing the work, you're talking to plant managers, people who work in the water treatment plant, and they're taught and trained to think about water in very specific ways. Then we go talk to elders and women and grandmothers and traditional knowledge holders, and they think about water. So it's always like, how do I even ask the right question? Because the water treatment plant operator, it's going to be, how do you relate to water? Sounds really weird to them because they're through that whole structure and process in their training, relate to water in very different ways. But we had our own processes that existed there. And how can any one of those kind of even technical, what I'll call technical processes, work to try to reconnect Indigenous peoples or communities back to water, as opposed to, what we often think about water coming out of the tap. That's what, civilized, developed people and communities do. So this is actually an image where I'm from, McGregor Bay. So what I was always taught, and every time we would have any kind of conversation around water, it always started off with in a ceremonial context, usually a water ceremony. It depends on where we were and what was possible to do. Always an offering of asema to water, and constantly reinforce. It always started with spirit. And any report that I'll be writing for Great Lakes or water, always starting with that. That was always really emphasized. And this is just an image of the recreation story. So for Inishnaabeg, we had and probably changes, like for in the Winnipeg area, it might be a different story than in the Great Lakes, which is very similar to the Haudenosaunee, or creation, recreation, or destruction, and then a recreation. Water is a big part of that. So that's what I'm trying to convey with this is always emphasize, always begins with spirit. So what are some of the Nebe ontologies? This isn't the complete list, because the report that I did for Chiefs of Ontario and then subsequent work later after that, like we did taking care of water, because elders didn't want to call it. We were trying to develop a protocol for a source water protection when Ontario was not a protocol, but a process for First Nation engagement. So Chiefs of Ontario was engaged with the Ministry of the Environment at the time, when there was a Ministry of the Environment in Ontario, and they were developing the Clean Water Act to sort of try to figure out how First Nations can be engaged in that process. But the elders and knowledge holders didn't really kind of like that terminology around governance or source water protection. To them, they saw it as a responsibility and an obligation that we had to a relative. So the title of that report is taking care of water, taking care of a relative, because you don't govern it. That was probably one of the big wake-up calls, was they don't think about water in the way that we're kind of being asked by the funders to think about water. So you're starting to come up against this tension in different ontologies around water. So this isn't an exhaustive list. And since then, there's been a number of different gatherings where we've worked at First Nations across the country, in Ontario, in their diversity in terms of how they think about how to think about their relationship and responsibilities in relation to water. So these are just a few highlights of some of the what I'll call the findings from that work. So water was thought of as being a relative. So you take care of water like you would a relative. We need to care for water. We're not governing it in the way that often laws and policies and programs are being implemented. And I looked at this because I looked across the country. How do people try to address water, either through source water protection or watershed planning? And it was definitely not definitely not the way that the way I was taught by a lot of these elders and knowledge holders in terms of how we relate to water. Women and girls have a special connection to water. That's very much Anishinaabeg focused, and I don't know if that's the same across the country. It seemed to be as part of the expert panel that report that was done in 2006. It came up there, but when I talked to Haudenosaunee communities, they conceptualized this a little bit differently. But in the work that we did, policy work, I'll just call it policy work with Chiefs of Ontario, that came up quite a bit. And you have to be safe with water as well, because there's also a dualism to water. Water can give life, but water can also take life if you're not respectful and you don't treat water in the way that as a relative, in the way that it should be treated. The other thing that's really come up is water isn't sort of an isolated way of experiencing and trying to understand the world or relate to the world. In the Anishinaabe tradition, we talk about the four elements: fire, water, earth, and wind or air. And water is one of those elements. So it's actually part of this broader kind of understanding. But I find myself, and probably many of us here, when we're going into these meetings around water, we're thinking about water in very particular ways. We're not necessarily thinking about it in relation to these other aspects of our way of being in the world, or for Anishinaabe, fire, and then earth, and then wind. So water is one of the elements, but it's not the only one. And we're often in this position having to kind of silo how we think about water. And even then it gets further broken down to social science around water, technical and engineering aspects around water. So it's hydrogeology, like it's just, we tend to separate things out when it actually came from, originally for us as an Anishinaabe holistic perspective around water. So it's one of our elements. So what is it? Learn this over time. Water can come from the sky for rainwater, water on the land, rivers, lakes, and streams. I guess folks would call that surface water. Women's water, so childbirth, that's a particular kind of water. We're water through our tears, our sweat, our blood. Salt water, again, that's water that we are, and I'll talk about other forms of water. And where this kind of wake-up call came, so even though I kind of knew this all like intellectually, it wasn't until we were doing a source water protection plan in a community, and there's no really good process to do this. So we customize it to the First Nation. And again, you always think about, as researchers, what are the kind of questions that we ask? Because if you don't ask good questions, you're not going to get maybe the kind of knowledge, or generate the kind of knowledge, or get the information that you need. We were working with the typical concept of water, even though we kind of knew there was an Anishinaabe and a First Nation one. And people I remember they just looked at us like we were kind of not very clever. Coming from the university, we're constantly having to teach you people. And because I was asking questions, well, where, like in the wintertime, where did you get drinking water then? Because when I grew up, we go down to the lake and literally get the H2O. But other people, it was like ice, it was snow. So people were getting drinking water from different places in different ways than we would think about. In the winter, it's actually easier to move because the lakes are frozen than having to go all the way around and going across the lake. And even where I'm from, people had dog sleds. It's faster to move across the ice than it is to kind of go all the way around, or even to canoe. So people thought about water very differently depending on the seasons. So there's that kind of aspect to it as well. in how do we relate to water and how we think about water. And so I started going, oh, there's a much broader idea about what water is in the community than even the kind of questions that we're asking, even as part of what we thought was our traditional knowledge protocol in doing this work. And then you get out to the community and then they correct you in terms of how water is thought about. It's not all, what comes out of the tap is such a limiting idea of what water is or how people recreate. So sweet water is one of the other kind of waters. That's maple syrup. That'll be coming up with weird kind of climate changey kind of stuff. Like literally, I was walking around barefoot in my backyard, and it's like February. Uh, is when maple sugar time is. My family owns a sugar bush, so there's ceremonies around when that water comes. And in the Anishinaabe tradition, that water came at a time of immense food insecurity. Very hard if the snow is deep to hunt, and the ice is starting to become unsafe. So access of fishing becomes a problem. But getting the sap was really important to us. But that's a whole other story. We have stories around that. But water again is thought about not just in the narrow way that we think about water. And again, there's always these stories that come along with how we understand water. Water is a teacher. So that also came up a lot in the work that we did. Uh, water teaches us how to be in the world. You hear the term "go with the flow." other ways of being. Sue Chibolo writes about this quite a bit in some of her publications as well. I'm just going to go through this a little bit more quickly. Water teaches us and learning about our responsibilities. This is just images of a water walk with youth when the late Josephine Mondawmin was trying to pass on to youth how to take up these responsibilities to water. So that was another part of the teachings. Giving versus taking. How do we start mostly what we do in society, even though we think, especially because you're a university that's got the sustainable development goals, sustainable development is still, I hate to say, still primarily based on how we keep taking sustainably. That is not an Anishinaabe way of thinking. Our way of thinking is instead of getting up every day and thinking about what you're going to take, how can I take this thing in a sustainable way? How can I mitigate this damage control kind of narrative? It's like I get up every day and think about what am I going to give? So it's a different kind of what's our gift going to be to water as well. So it's a different, I call it a different way of being in the world. Anyway, there's lots to say about that, but I'm moving through this a little bit quickly. The gift of the 13 moons. So that was just very recently. I actually have what I call my moon water here. Be drinking over the next few days. And I'll talk a little bit about this, how I'm relating like water and the 13 moon to climate change in this project that I'm working on. But you see like our concept of nature and environment goes beyond what's on the planet. It's also including the moon, and then the turtle grounds you very specifically as one of those kind of creatures that can live in the water and live on the land, but still connects us out to the natural world. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what is water? I was quite disappointed when I started, this all started to dawn on me. I thought, I need to think about, okay, I'm in these rooms, we're having these conversations around water, but we're meaning different things. What is it? And this is kind of what I've just came up with by doing searches in different dictionaries. Doesn't say anything about like water is life, water is a relative, the kind of things that elders and traditional knowledge holders were saying. And this is all true. Like what I'm showing you on the screen, it's not like it's not true. It's just not the only thing that's true. But when we're talking about water, we're meaning different things because of our ontology and how we understand and relate to, and how we relate to water. Anyway, I was really quite disappointed, but it explained a lot. It explains particularly the World Water Reports. That'll be coming out, I guess, in about 3 weeks or so. So water is treated as a subject or object. This is just drawing upon Professor Kraft's work. And there's legal relationships between beings, again, structured on the basis of spirit. So she does a lot of her work, as you know, in Northwestern Ontario and Manitoba. I think also maybe Cree into the prairies as well. And the same message. It like spirit is the center, spirit is where it all starts from. And that's where all the other legal understandings come from. So that seems to be similar, although yeah, I'm pretty sure that we would find that if all the nations were asked kind of the same question, but or same kind of had the same kind of conversations. So when you think about water and the way that I talked about here, a lot of the way that water is treated kind of makes sense in a disturbing kind of way. I talked about the World Water Reports because I actually analyzed these in a paper I wrote around ontology of water because I said, why are they not getting it? I get excited every year, like, oh, are they finally gonna? We just get terrible things, not going to be water. A lot of people don't have water. Billions of people aren't going to have clean water and safe drinking water. But they had a really narrow idea of what water is. Harvesting water for our needs, reducing the risk of extreme situations. They have a very, very kind of narrow idea of what water is. Maybe this year it'll be different, but I get all excited. I think one year they did talk about values around water, which of course means that it's not going to be given as much weight as technical and scientific kind of understandings in relation to water. But that ontology of water really influences how then advocacy that happens in terms of global policy and national policy, right? So it has huge implications on the people who think about water and experience water very differently. Well, on everybody. So the nature of water. This is from Walken. That water kind of defies boundaries. I'm not going to read the quote. You can look at it there. That water just doesn't. It just doesn't have like it's very hard to create water in a very bounded kind of way. Even if you wanted to go at surface kind of boundaries, so you have to account for what's underneath. So even doing watershed planning could be a challenge because you're having to define things by boundaries. So she was talking about the nature of water. I see this in the water declaration. So one of the things I do to try to get an understanding how Indigenous folks might be thinking about water is I look at the different international declarations. So Indigenous peoples come together from all over the place over the years, couple decades, and have these conversations. So I'm pretty comfortable with saying in these situations, could be like 60 nations gathering, people from around the world. Pretty comfortable saying this is how people think about water in these kind of situations. And these are often when the world water meetings are happening and Indigenous peoples usually are on the outside looking in and not part of the conversations itself. So you're on the outside and they come up with their own declarations. And again, similar to what I see in the Ontario context and what I've seen across Canada, talk about water and our obligations to water and our responsibilities, and that we have our own laws and protocols. Water is not a commodity. Water is a spirit. So again, you see those common, has its own inherent rights to exist. These come up in the Indigenous declarations. I think I already talked about that. Water is also thought about in terms of human rights. And I absolutely agree that there needs to be human rights around water. There are terrible things that are happening to people being denied water. I think just yesterday I saw something about maybe it's Mexico City. Don't have a lot of people don't have access to water. But again, one of the underlying, I guess, assumptions in this particular water ontology is that humans are separate from water. So humans need water that's over there in order to live. So even though it's a good thing, absolutely, there needs to be these resolutions and this needs to be brought to light. There needs to be a special rapporteur. It's still based on this binary of separation of people from water, even though we're mostly water and we relate to water in very particular ways. So I would never say that human rights and water is not important, but it is based on a very particular kind of assumption about humans' relationship to water. So UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 25 speaks about our responsibilities to uphold these responsibilities for future generations. So thinking long into the future. These are just some examples of how these different ontologies might be represented. An image of the late Josephine Mondamin and her water walks, really raising awareness. I mean, she was a very humble person, but basically she created a movement and an awareness that didn't exist before. Or it was there, but it really wasn't in the kind of consciousness that it is now, particularly in Indigenous communities. when I first started facilitating meetings in relation to water, Great Lakes, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, I would be the only woman in the room and I was a facilitator. So a very male dominated, so there's a gendered aspect to this, very male dominated kind of conversations. And but now when I'm facilitating meetings, you see a lot more women, maybe even sometimes 50%, depending on the topic, a little bit more, and young people, young women. You didn't see that before. They tended to be kind of technical people. Those were the experts in relation to water. But she had such a huge influence in terms of influencing who should be part of those conversations and who should be there in any kind of gathering, and having a say. So this is just a bit on Indigenous knowledge systems. Mostly what I'm wanting to say here relates to my first comment around Indigenous peoples and nations were complete societies. So we had our own knowledge systems, which is based on how we relate to our relatives and other beings in creation, including our ancestors and future generations. So much broader concept. Generally, when folks are thinking about traditional knowledge and water, it's looking at knowledge as simply data or some kind of information to be extracted from communities that gets plopped into these other kind of frameworks. Anyway, it's another story to get into. When I was asked to contribute, a small piece to the on water, Indigenous peoples and vulnerability in Canada and the US, how traditional knowledge was thought about very strangely, and didn't really represent how Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge is understood and experienced, or what the ontology of that knowledge is in actual communities. But maybe we could chat about that later, or later on. This you would have saw from Ame Craft, very amazing work that she did around Anishinaabeg water laws. Water is spirit. We don't own water. I'm not going to read them all. Water must flow. But if you look in the Magpie River, water has rights. I don't know if it's a protocol or their law. A lot of these are very similar. Water must flow. So even though they're Innu, I believe, in I think that river is in Labrador, that is very similar in terms of what water law might look like and what water rights might look like. Not like Indigenous people's water rights, but actual water rights, like water as an entity, and water's own rights. So she talked about the project called Decolonizing Water, which I always thought was kind of weird when I first heard of it. I'm like, how do you decolonize water? Because water it's the people that need to be decolonized. But it needs to be considered in these conversations, and I find a lot of the times they're not. So a few weeks ago, we were in conversation with, this is through a committee I'm on with the Assembly of First Nations, with the Canadian Water Agency, and they don't like to go there. But if you don't account for this in terms of the history in Canada, then there's a very real possibility that you're going to recolonize. We don't, as I'm hoping, as a general rule, don't want to do that. So there's still a real resistance to account for this in policy development or any kind of programming. Like even when I was doing a review of source water plans and watershed plans across Canada, don't really like to account, like First Nations are barely accounted for in those processes, let alone colonialism. So it could really still continue to impose these kind of processes on Indigenous peoples. So again, this is drawing on a lot of M.A. Craft's work. Water is still being dominated by a particular worldview and ontology. And so just like Indigenous peoples, very hard to disrupt that, I guess. Even with Indigenous advocacy and input, it's still very challenging. Although I think it could happen, and in my view, already is happening at the community level. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about water and environmental justice, because I had an environmental justice chair, so I was applying that lens for a while in terms of how do I assess the injustice in relation to water. And one of the things that I learned was, so probably everyone here knows about. These are the injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations people experience in relation to how water is governed and managed in Canada, which is barely, because we don't have a federal federal process, so it tends to be provincial or territorial. And it was still very much focused on how Indigenous people are denied the H2O version of water in various ways. It's unsafe. It's not coming out of the tap. We need more. We need the techno fixes. So the techno fix is very much focused on a very particular ontology of water. And what I learned in doing this work with elders and with folks around when I was doing the work in the Great Lakes was that water is understood to have its own rights and responsibilities, and people, humans, don't have the right to infringe upon those or disrupt them or cause negative things to happen. Because when you do, there's going to be negative consequences back on us. So if we disrespect water, don't recognize the rights of water by contaminating it, then that ends up being harmful to us as we drink the water or eat the fish that live in the water that's contaminated. We don't have the right to do that if we're going to respect water's own rights. And so a lot of the injustice is to water itself, not just Indigenous peoples have this impact because of H2O water injustice, but water as an entity and a relative to be cared for also has its own rights, if you can kind of see where I'm going with that or what the ontology is to that. And a lot of the solutions and responses don't recognize this. As I pointed out, they tend to be very techno-fix type of approaches, billions of dollars being pumped into that. And I will say that is important. I would never say that's not important. Just in a community where you can't really drink the water there. So it's important to recognize that. They don't deal with a lot of the damage that's already done. And so there's a very different way of thinking about water rights and water justice in Canada that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So I talked about a way to be. What will our gifts be? So how those are expressed by Indigenous communities, I call these like the appropriate responses as opposed to the other responses, which are there and important. Indigenous response might be to protect. So this is on the picture of the woman with the feather. She is engaged in direct action on the East Coast to protect water. So that's a First Nation response to trying to protect and care for a relative. The other is holding the copper pot is the youth. I think she's still a youth. Autumn Pelche engaging in ceremonial responses or in ceremonies and respecting the spiritual aspects of relation to water, living up to those laws and responsibilities. Another appropriate response in relation to water that often doesn't get considered or part of these kind of conversations that I often find myself in relation to water. So how are we going to be in relation to water, I think, is a question we kind of need to ask ourselves. And what is our gift going to be back to water so we're not always taking? Listening to the land. So I'll be brief here. I'm probably getting a bunch of chat saying I've got a few minutes left. Okay, listening to the land. So this is a project that I've been working on in climate change in relation to water. And what I'm doing is documenting change with each of one of the moons, the 13 moons. And on the turtle's back is the 13 I guess different, actually it's one moon, but 13 different phases to it. And the reason why I started to do this, and I was trying to do it in ways that are totally outside of what I know, which is like policy, governance, right things, but more trying to record it in different ways and in a more experiential way, because sitting in front of the computer writing about stuff is not how you learn about the natural world or the best way to learn about the natural world in the way that I talked about. To actually be out there, to notice things, because as we get older, we're taught not to notice things because we're trying to get from point A to point B. Kids know how to do that. And so, because I would be in these, climate change and water circles, and they would always tell me that Indigenous peoples, we don't have a baseline. And I say, yeah, we do. We know what should be happening with each moon. And when that's not happening, like this recent moon, we know there's a problem. So it becomes like a way of our assessment in terms of what's happening in relation to the world. And water isn't just what's the H2O around me that I rely on for maybe drinking, it's also how the moon influences water. Our relationship as women to the moon, or even as humans to the moon, and to the turtle. So it encompasses all these kind of relationships that are much broader than just the typical concept of how, or the typical sort of ontology of water that I'm often dealing with in policy and legal frameworks. And miigwech, so I'll stop there. Hopefully that kind of made sense. I mean, every one of those slides could be a whole other thing on it altogether. But hopefully there's enough little gems in there that we have enough of the discussion. And I'm keen to kind of hear your views and what some of your experiences have been. So thank you for listening to that. I'll stop share. There we go.
Thank you. That was amazing. I learned so much. Okay, so I will open the floor to questions. I see you have lots of hands clapping, so I think everybody really appreciated your presentation. I don't see any
I think
questions.
there's a question in the webinar chat.
A webinar
Okay.
chat
From Steph. Okay, so I see a comment, yes, / question from Steph McLaughlin. So I'll read it. You can feel free to read it too, of course. Thanks so much for an amazing talk. Much of made these days of the, I'm going to butcher this, but Mi'kmaq concept of Utamatmuk or two-eyed seeing as taught by elders Merdina and Albert Marshall, which is positive in some ways since it seems to make room for Indigenous ways of knowing around the environment. But are there problems of linking both Indigenous science and Western science when so much of Western science is colonial and overly dominant in the way it proceeds? And if so, what are the best ways of managing these imbalances in power?
So that's thank you for that question. It's a great question. And actually 2 weeks ago, I was in Denver, and that's what we were talking about, bringing US and Canadian Indigenous scholars together to talk about Indigenous science. Like, what is it? One of the first questions, because really being pushed by Environment Canada and climate change to be part of assessments. And we talked about these kind of questions. And again, to me, it always starts with our underlying assumptions. So Western science, in terms of how it's practiced, probably I think actual scientists might think differently about it, or at least some scientists. It already starts on the premise of human nature separation, I noticed. And so that's one of the first assumptions. And then once the dominant has that kind of assumptions, it's looking for that in trying to understand other people's I guess there's also an ontology in relation to Indigenous science. So I always think to myself, the question isn't the question around Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous science and Western science and Western knowledges. The question is what's the relationship going to be between Indigenous peoples and scientists? Like, that's the relationship that needs to get sorted out. But we become so obsessed with focused on the knowledge. And when that happens, that's when the relationship can be very, I guess I'll just say it, can be kind of exploitive, because then it becomes, how can Indigenous peoples accommodate themselves so knowledge can be extracted from them to fit into somebody else's framework? How does it become palatable to that kind of framework? That's not a good relationship. So the way that I often try to answer that is, it's like scientists and Indigenous peoples have to primarily, actually, I think scientists, because Indigenous peoples, in my experience, in my view, have a lot of experience dealing with Western everything. Like, we have no choice. That was part of the colonial project, continues. We're used to we know, like, we're dealing with all that all the time. But a lot of scientists are not trained to work with Indigenous peoples, or even with non-scientists. Like, those of you who are scientists know that. Like, you're not trained to work with non-scientists. If you're engineer, you're not, let alone Indigenous peoples and self-determination and sovereignty. Oh my God, rights. Like, how do we even account for that in our work? They're not. So there's like a huge responsibility and learning curve for scientists, and I say that very broadly, to learn that. I think there's a little bit more guidance coming out on that. I work with other scholars trying to figure out, well, what would we tell scientists then? Like, what do they need to understand? Lawrence Ignace has done work around this, around these are the things you need to think about on drip and rights, depending on where you are doing this work, because it's actually people who are who actually have to be able to work together to figure out how our knowledge systems are going to generate or co-produce is another word that's being used a lot right now. And knowledges that they're going to help deal with the challenges that we're facing. And the question made me think of the first time I started talking about traditional knowledge sort of in government kind of context. So I worked for Environment Canada for 10 years, and that was one of my files. But before that, I remember there was a number of us and we were delivering a workshop because it was showing up in being considered sort of in environmental legislation with Environment Canada, and no one really quite knew what this concept was and how do we work with it, what is it, science-based departments, DFO, Environment Canada. And they had really hard time. The scientists really had a hard time with trying to wrap their heads around like the values. What do you mean values? It's not objective and this and that and everything else. And one of the questions I asked them, because it was Environment Canada, so maybe it's biased, is, I mean, you're here because you want to protect the environment. That's the mandate: protection, conservation, restoration of the environment. Like, why? Like, why are you interested? Like why are you here? Like, why are you interested in it? Why did you get the degree that you did? And almost all of them, well, the ones who were asked and volunteered their responses, it was because of how, like, what they learned from their families. My grandfather used to take me out. My family took me out. Like, they were basically caring and learning in the same way that Indigenous people did, but they didn't recognize it as actually being knowledge and influencing them in terms of the career path that they chose. And that we're actually are kind of interested in the same thing. They were trained in a way to separate that out, that didn't matter, and that, you know, the experiments and publications and everything else is what mattered. In that kind of relationship. So I do think there's a lot of, because I think the onus has to come on, like, it can't always be put on Indigenous peoples all the time, because we're doing it all the time anyway, right? Water treatment plant operators are dealing with science and technology and engineers and whatever else all the time. But a lot of the engineers and those folks aren't dealing with Indigenous people all the time. So they're really, quite frankly, not that good at it. And when they get fronted with something that they haven't seen before, they don't know how to deal with it. So there's a real, that part actually has to be, the burden, there has to be a burden there that doesn't fall to Indigenous people to learn what that means. And I'm not saying social scientists get that either, but often in universities anyway, there's ethics protocols, there's training that occurs that people have to think about, at least in some of their academic training, to be able to do that. So I don't know if I answered your question. Like, we had a big discussion on that because we thought, well, how do we sort this out? We're trying to do these assessments. They want Indigenous science, and like nobody knows really how to do that except Indigenous people, because they're doing it all the time. And so the other thing that I'll say about it, Blind Deloria Jr., the late Blind Deloria Jr., wrote about this a lot. And the way he talked about Indigenous science was, it always included our morals and ethics. So it always included our values and who we were. And he basically said it was realizing what our responsibilities and obligations and duties were to our relatives, to the natural world, including the sun and the moon and the sky. That's how he described. And that's actually really hard to do. That's actually not easy to do at all. It might sound easy, but it's not easy to do that. So people have thought about this. And we're getting to the point where we can actually say, how's it going to happen? Before it was sort of like arguing about why it should happen. But now at least we're having a conversation about how can this happen? And how do we make it happen, you know, by 2025, before the nature assessment comes out? So people have ideas. I want to hear what they are, because it's like such a sense of urgency to be able to figure some of this out, right? So thank you for the question. Hopefully some of that made sense. We didn't solve all the problem, but we were certainly good at, academics, as you know, are really good at diagnosing problems, not so good at exactly figuring out what the pathway out of it is.
I'd have to agree with that. And Steph, who asked you the question, says, thank you. That's a really thoughtful response, and there's loads to ponder there for someone non-Indigenous, at least. I absolutely agree with that. Thank you very much. That is something I think people, especially in academia, have thought about quite a bit. So I have another question from Josh. He says, Chi Miigwech, as someone whose people are not from this land, I'm new to this ontology. I'm also new to learning about water. Are there resources you can suggest for further teachings that I might access to help me improve my relationship with waters on land where I have some relationship? And he adds that he's not an allied professional, just a retiree who would like to help and learn.
I think there's more resources. If Pauline can put in the chat the Decolonizing Water website. I mean, that is very specific around Northwestern Ontario. Well, I guess some of our work should be going on there around the Great Lakes. It's a good resource. There's videos on there. There's the ebook done with Karen Bacher around like language in water. How do we even talk about water? So there's it's, to me, it's a good resource, not the only one, but it'll point you to others. Like there's a toolkit. How do we think about spiritual entities in the water and how do you care for them? I didn't even talk about that. So I usually point people to that. I mean, I have some stuff on the environmental justice website that I have, but I don't just focus on water. There's climate and, you know, other, I have to cover a lot more stuff than just water in that particular website, but there's work around there too. Yeah, that would be the one that's a good starting place, where it's very much focused on indigenous perspective. And because it's funded through a big SSHRC research grant, you should have access to it, and it's there for generating this knowledge for folks to learn. There's other resources, but they're not funded like that in the same way. So, but they are. I would start there.
Thank you. And Pauline did put the link to the Decolonizing Water as well as your work that was shared through the IEJ project websites in the chat for people. So now I have a question from Rapi Chan. It says, thank you so much for your important talk. I'd love to hear more about your listening to the moon work. How can we become more attuned to the relation between the moon and water, especially when the colonial system we live under subjects us to the Gregorian solar calendar and everything is fixed in a very specific way?
It's literally what I try to do at my students. I try to get them, and the moon is a good, I guess, relative to connect to, because even in a city like Toronto, I could still see the moon. It was beautiful and bright. You can't see the stars, so even with the light pollution, or even during the pandemic when I was trying to get students to do land-based, nature-based, outside-based kind of activities, you can even see it from inside. And what I'll say is, I'm assuming most folks, we're educators and we're researchers, is we spend a lot of time in front of a screen, not necessarily spending a lot of time. Maybe there's field research, but it's not that long. And but it was something that this connection that we had to the natural world, we literally had when we were children. Because we hadn't educated a lot of people. We totally favor written word over just about anything else. And but when little kids so for me, what I try to encourage them to do is notice things again. Use your senses, not just the Aristotle senses, but there's other senses as well that we have. And because when you were little, you used to notice things, but if you're a parent trying to get your kid to school, could you quit looking at those ants? We got to move along, got to get there on time. Or quit looking at that, quit looking at the butterflies on the flowers, quit looking at, we're just discouraging young people, children, from engaging with the natural world, so we can rush them off somewhere. And that's kind of what we do. When I work with students, I get them to do this all the time. And that's why, to me, the land acknowledgement is really important. I get why there might be why there's criticisms, because it could be performative, and a checkbox is actually trying to encourage people to understand and relate to where they are right now. Who are the people? What are the other relatives and entities that are there? Are you even noticing them? What are they? So I actually try to get them to do that, and they struggle with it initially. Like, I'm a crazy person, law professor, why are you making me do this? That's where natural law also comes from. And so you actually need to notice these things. Go out and start to notice things, not rush from point A to point B trying to get to Timmy's to get your coffee or whatever it is. So it's actually trying to get them to develop in other ways than the way that our education system has I guess encouraged people or trained people as our way of engaging with the world is like disengaging and studying and learning in very not engaging kind of way with directly with the natural world at all. So I tried to do that in that project. It's really hard for me because I always imagine like it's what I do, traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge, but I was not spending a lot of time actually engaging. So it forces me to do that. I look forward to it. Get eaten alive by mosquitoes, usually in the May moon, but you know, I'm just like, that's how it is, you know. So it's really trying to re-engage in that way that we used to be able to do. For Indigenous peoples, that way is not that long. Like I don't say that's something my ancestors did a long time ago. They actually did it like growing up. Like that's what we did. There isn't that long period of time when it didn't happen. So it might be more work for other people to try to engage. But if you're in a place in Canada, Indigenous peoples were there, you're in a place, and I think the land acknowledgement helps people provide some of that guidance, or I hope they do, about how they're trying to be a responsible, you know, good ancestor for that territory, how they're going to ensure what their gifts are going to be to that place so that future generations can also benefit from the place that they're into. So it sounds kind of basic, but that's actually what it's really actually hard to teach it. I have law students or graduate students. They've been in the system like a really long time to just ignore that and not care about that. It's not important. Yeah, I'll stop there because I can go on and on and on and on about it. Their next assignment's in a couple of weeks because I try to assign it so that they do the first one and it's crossing over different seasons so they can notice things. And yeah, so I'll stop there. Or hopefully they notice things.
That sounds really neat. Thank you. So I am aware we're at the end of our time. There is one more question. So I think what I'll do is I'll make my closing announcements. And then for anybody who has a few more minutes, I'll ask the last question if you have a few minutes, Deborah, just to let that person answer. So for everyone else, because it is at the end of our official time, thank you for attending this seminar. It's been really great. We have our next talk, which is on March 18th, and that is with Melanie O'Gorman and Stuart Hill, and they will be talking about the long-term drinking water advisories in Manitoba First Nations, what is needed to sustainably resolve them. And then we did have one more question from Marissa, so I will ask that. That's okay. It says, thank you for the visuals to support the conversation. I am also interested in finding ways to teach youth to be more sensitive through formal and informal education. And I think you kind of answered this with your course stuff as well. In the conversations you attend, is there space made for youth voices and or education? And Marissa also says she is Indigenous and in Faculty of Education in an arid landscape focused on science education for middle graders.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about that, but I'm basically dealing with university students, not that great at dealing with children that age. Although fortunately for me, my mom, my husband, and my sister all teach teach that age. Believe me, when they're asking me to do World Water Day stuff in the school from K to like 6, like that is way scarier than any academic audience because I'm like, do I make sense? Like, am I even saying the right stuff to kids? So actually some of the work I did is directly with youth, and they think outside the box already. So I don't have so much time to talk about it now, but the climate change youth gathering, I facilitated it. It was their gathering. That's when different kind of words started to come out. So they were very, very interested in how do we establish a reconnection with the earth. They talked about values. Love came up a lot, and that never comes up in these other circles that I find myself in terms of our relationship to the natural world or to water. How do we show love? And maybe it means we don't love the earth anymore in future generations. Like their questions and comments were so completely different and hugely influential to how I talk about this. Do this kind of work in these other kind of spaces, what values actually matter to youth. And actually right now, working with you to think about what well-being means. Like, what does well-being mean? And how do we know that we're well? And what does that mean to youth? And what's coming out there is family. Family, actually, for Anishinaabe people, that was the center of everything. Like that's where law came from. That's where knowledge was generated from. So being cared for and feeling secure in family. So which is different than how academics might think, or they might think of that in a very abstract kind of way. But for youth, it's very real in their lives, like today and tomorrow and yesterday, this morning. What I will say is my approach, and I actually don't really know how effective it is. I should maybe ask is because World Water Day is coming up again, and they'll probably say, "Hey, why don't you do something?" I had to talk to my sister. I'm like, how do I make this relevant to like 8-year-olds? And what we did was she goes, "Oh, well, just take pictures from around the community and ask if they recognize it, because you'll have to have been outside to recognize it." And they can. They'll go, "Hey, that's where we go swimming. Hey, that." So it connects them. I mean, this is like delivering a presentation virtually, but you could do it in person. That would be way more fun. And so it's trying to get them to draw on stuff that they already know. And it's outside, and remembering that's where we picnic with my family. That's where we go swimming. So they start to connect family and being with other people, with being on the land. And that was the advice that they gave me, because really, quite frankly, I'm not good at that, even though I raised a couple of kids. So, maybe I could have been a better parent in that regard. But it's a good question and something that I think about quite a bit. But I do have to draw on my mom, who's a teacher for 30 years, and my sister and husband who teach in that particular age group, to say, I don't know how to do this. When I do stuff with youth, though, because I'm yet another kind of middle-aged old lady, like telling a bunch of young people what to think about things, they're kind of tired of that. So I always bring youth with me. I'll just tell people I can't do your thing unless I'm allowed to bring youth, because they need to see other youth and they want to hear from other youth perspectives. So my son's been dragged around to lots of things, and some of his friends, because I said that's what they want to see. Like their whole lives are like people like me telling them what they should be learning and thinking about the world. But they actually a lot of the times want to hear from other young people. So that's something that I notice that they really appreciate as well. But I also know my limitations. I'm not great at it. So I rely I rely on other people. Just 30 years of teaching post-secondary, you become good at that, but not so good at the other teaching different other age groups. So I'll own that. So, but good question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And there was one comment: so helpful to think of ontology as a vehicle of revealing changing, because it is back to basics, fundamentals, etc., and reminding us to be outside. Thank you so much. And there's many more thank you so muches for your presentation. So thank you so much. This was wonderful, and we hope to see everyone else next month.
Yeah, thank you for joining me, and yeah, and letting me talk about something I like to talk about. So enjoy the rest of your day.
You as well. Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.